as we get into our concepts and understanding what consciously inclusive means, before we get there, I want to make sure that we define a few things that are pretty important to us. So the first is the concept of diversity. And we throw that term out there, that's diversity and inclusion, of course. But when I look at the definitions of diversity, it really boils down to this gorgeously simple approach. Diversity is the many similarities and differences between people. Period. So that's it. I mean, when you look at all the definitions, it's the similarities and the differences between people. But again, you also hear diversity and inclusion. So what do we mean by inclusion? Well, if I take a step back and look at that concept, inclusion is a place with a culture of respect, collaboration, and connectedness for everyone. And when I first started understanding these terms, it was actually when I worked at Disney. One of my colleagues and mentors said it so beautifully. She said, diversity is being invited to the dance, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And I always thought that was kind of a cool way to think about the difference between diversity and inclusion. But one of the things you start to hear a lot of now is the concept of belonging. And that's really where we're evolving to as an inclusive workplace. And when we look at the definition of belonging, it's the feeling a person has where they are safe and welcome to be their authentic selves at work. And so diversity is, bringing the differences and similarities of the people in. Inclusion is kind of the culture we're creating. Belonging spins it around to the employee or the individual and talks about how do they feel within the workplace. Do they feel a sense of belonging, a sense of respect, a sense that they can bring their authentic selves to work? And that's really what we're trying to strive to do when we be consciously inclusive in the workplace. So it really turns it on to the employee-centric approach, which I think is really where we all want to be. So with those definitions in mind, I want to move on from our opening and welcoming and defining the definition to the next part, which of course is the title of this conversation, you being consciously inclusive. So using the chat area, I'd like to ask you, what do you think Steve means by being consciously inclusive? Go ahead and type in your thoughts in the chat here in a few moments. So I see somebody writing or typing in. Excellent. Amanda, deliberately including others. Great. Jonathan, making an effort to seek others' opinions. Okay. Amir, consciously including others, using consciously verb. Well done. Juanita, as a leader, being mindful to reach out to others. So, I mean, these are all great, and they're really hitting upon the concepts when we think about being consciously inclusive. I use a definition which actually summarizes a lot of what you've just said, is being consciously inclusive is when you make a deliberate or conscious effort to seek out ideas, perspectives, and experiences that differ from the majority and or your own. And so it is being deliberate. It is being conscientious of seeking out those differences, especially if those differences are beyond what you currently have. So well done on that. So as we look at this definition, I want to zero in on those two words, consciously inclusive, and think about the antonyms or the opposites of those two words. And really the opposite, of course, meaning of that phrase is unconsciously exclusive. And that's kind of what we want to make sure to be consciously inclusive leaders. We want to get ahead of, well, wait a minute, where are we unconsciously excluding others around us? Quick scientific note, fact. We as humans receive 11 million bits of information at every one moment. What does that mean? Well, every nerve ending that we have, we're receiving data. All the cones in our eyes, we're receiving all that information. The cilia in our ears is picking up all this information. All that's dumping on us 11 million bits of data at any one moment. That's a lot. Interestingly, though, and thank you neuroscientists for figuring this out, we can only consciously process 40 bits of data. Think about that. We're receiving 11 million bits at any one moment through all of our nerve endings, but our conscious mind can only think about or focus on 40 bits. So there's a delta, there's a gap. So that 99.999996%, if I got all my nines right, that delta, that gap is where our unconscious is kind of running the show and interpreting that data. So kind of how's this play out? For example, you're on a low-cost carrier or low-cost to you, and where you don't pick your seat when we could travel a little bit differently than maybe right now. But you sit down in your seat and you're watching people come down the aisle and you're saying, no, No. Yes, they can sit here. That's fine. You're making these very, very quick decisions without truly thinking about it. Or you're in the kitchen cooking and you lean your hand on a hot stove. It takes that millisecond before you're like, ouch, got to lift it up. Well, that's from the unconscious kicking in and saying, hey, 40 bits, this is maybe your thing. You might want to like manage this right now. And so that's what's happening in the background. Your computer does the same thing. If you go to your task manager and you look at like what functions or what operations are happening right now on your hard drive, it might say Zoom or whatever tool we're using right now to kind of communicate, but it has all these other things happening in the background. Yes, that's how our minds work. And so we want to be conscientious of that, because we want to ask the question, okay, so do we have bias? If you're in this room and you're breathing and you're human, yes, you do have bias, but we need to understand, well, which ones do we have? Because that will vary, of course, depending on a lot of different things. So being mindful that we have bias because of that massive amount of our unconsciousness that's really taking over, but which biases do we have? Now, with that being said, going back to the chat, why does this matter? Why does being consciously inclusive matter? What do you think? Go ahead and type in your responses in the chat there. All right, Brian, makes people feel welcomed and important. Excellent. Richard, helps create a business where people want to stay. Interesting. Alex, people feel they belong. Okay. Cindy, employees feel connected and respected. Yes, and I'm seeing a theme with your responses, which is fantastic. I use the term, which is actually, again, similar to some of the things that you've said. Ultimately, being consciously inclusive leads to a workplace where people feel a sense of belonging and a feeling of trust. What does that mean? Well, when I wrote my book, Pride Leadership, I've been doing a lot of podcasts since the book came out last year. And I remember this one gentleman asked me, he's like, Steve, do you know the secret to leadership success? I'm like, I do. You ready? You want to hear it? He's like, yeah, I do. I said, I could have taken my 356-page book, reduced it to one page, and written one word on it. And guess what? It's on the slide that you're seeing here. And I actually had these slides for him during the podcast just to kind of make it visual and fun. And he's like, belonging? I'm like, close. Trust. And that's your secret. If you sleep through everything that I'm talking about today, if you remember that the essence of effective leadership is fostering and building a feeling of trust, you're golden, because that's when being consciously inclusive means. We're building trust, we're building respect, we're building rapport with people around us. And what does that mean? Well, that means success in your workplace. Success can be defined however you'd like it. It could be financial success. It could be success for meeting our goals as a team. It could be whatever that means. But being consciously inclusive fosters that sense of belonging, which leads to people wanting to stay, building trust, and that leads to success. And that's what we're trying to do about being consciously inclusive. And that's kind of the goal. So when I think about kind of moving on to the bulk of our conversation here today, and that's really thinking about smart strategies that you as smart leaders can use to be more consciously inclusive, I'd like to start with a story.